midday-ish, and I'm sure there's lots of things that people would like to discuss based on what we heard earlier this morning. So on the agenda there are some questions which I'm interested in, and I'm sure there are others. Before we do that, before we go into maybe addressing some of these questions, which I'd like to do, is there anything that has come up this morning which people have been itching to address? A large question which someone would like to bring up now, which we weren't able to have time to in the morning discussion. So any part of it in response to any one of the presentations?
Can I just make one comment? That my sense this morning is that there's a lot of focus on the asset, clinical candidates, and small molecules. My own view, Matt, is that we were just chatting about this. My own view is that we as a community know how to generate clinical candidates. If I give GSK a target, I'm confident within 2, 3, 4 years they will get a clinical candidate. And so that's really not the issue for me in terms of drug discovery. For me, the big issue is, and I was just chatting outside, sort of in humans we've got 22,000 proteins, and any one of those proteins could be a target for drug discovery. And then we've got hundreds of diseases and hundreds of sub-diseases. And our ability to link one of those proteins with one of those diseases is appalling. And unfortunately, I believe a lot of the preclinical models we use, animal models, cellular assays we use, they are not predictive of what happens in patients. That's why the industry is in a crisis. They spend all this money, and then after 6 years they take something into patients and 9 times out of 10 it fails. But I think, generating targets, better validated targets, I think that's what we need to do together. And then once we've identified that 1 in 10 target, then industry can do what it's brilliant at. Industry is brilliant at generating clinical candidates.
So I've got to follow up on that though, because I remember being at a talk by Stephen Friend from Sage, who was talking about this idea that there's no such thing as a disease, it's all about disease-patient interaction. And so you're no longer thinking about the way a compound needs to treat a patient, you're talking about the way the drug interacts with that individual. Now, if that's the case, and if we need that level of data to make progress on a problem, then firstly, inevitably we need to share much more than we are doing at the moment, in terms of data between projects. But I was wondering about whether that analysis of drug discovery is applicable to things like cancer, perhaps in the developed world. Is it realistic to talk on that level of detail about diseases, pathogens that affect the developing world? I don't know. Is the same argument? Does the same argument apply no matter what disease it is?
I think it will do, and Marion and I were just chatting about this. Marion is trying to generate affordable medicines for malaria. I absolutely believe that, in 20 years' time, for a new drug for Alzheimer's, it's got to be affordable for the governments across the world. We cannot charge what Vertex are charging for their new cystic fibrosis drug, which is $200,000 a year for one patient. Now they can charge that because it only works in 4% of the patients, and in those 4% it works spectacularly. But maybe that illustrates it, that in future we will not just say, oh, this is an Alzheimer's patient, or this is a cancer patient. Increasingly we will say, this is their genotype, or this is their mutation, and we will use that to stratify the patient. So the whole thing is actually getting more complex. And so if it's getting more complex and more difficult and more expensive, then we're going to have to open our doors even more.
Yeah, Charlie.
So I guess I've stepped from the pharma industry to DNDi where I work now, and we're invested heavily in phenotypic drug discovery. This is a reflection of how difficult it is to select targets, but also perhaps a reflection that single targets don't deliver the efficacy that we seek. So what's your view on trying to bridge the gap, if you like, from single target-based drug discovery to perhaps multi-target and phenotypic delivery for true clinical efficacy?
And I think if you believe the disease is in a cell, one cell or one bug, you can adopt that sort of approach. But if you're thinking about schizophrenia or chronic pain, where there's probably 30 different cell types in different parts How on earth are we going to do it? Now, I totally agree with you that one of the reasons that we've failed as an industry is that we have been obsessed by single molecular targets. We've been seduced by them. And I think so the reason I'm working on epigenetics is that I believe that these targets are much earlier in the disease cascade, and therefore they're more likely to be better drug targets for patients.
I'd just like to make a point on the fact I agree completely that the people who can make the small molecule candidates are pharma. That's been their bread and butter for decades. For the diseases we're looking at where there is no value, there has to be some incentive for those pharma to do that. At the moment, the major incentive is visionaries at the top commit their companies to do that sort of research, such as GSK. But I've also worked with companies where the visionary has left and the commitment has gone with that person. So it's not sustainable in my mind, or it's risky in terms of being sustainable. And that's where I think making small molecules, we can't, unless there are more sustainable mechanisms of rewarding or encouraging pharma to invest in these diseases which are of no value, and it is a capitalist business, we live in that sort of world, then it's a high risk.
Well, can I make a quick analogy? Sorry, can I make a quick analogy based on that? Another capitalist business is law. The biggest law firms engage a certain percentage of their time in pro bono activities. And in the legal profession in the UK, it's required that a law firm does 3% pro bono or something. Now, big pharma today have been involved in monolithic contributions to the public good, so the TCANSER and other things, and pill donations. Right? But if it was broken down into a percentage of people's time, you could have these small contributions that accelerate drug discovery programs that are in the public domain. So the idea of pro bono being translated from law firms into the pharma sector would, I think, impact significantly on a lot of projects. If that was seen as being something that was good, so in law it's mandated, if you want to be a member of the Law Society of the UK, I forget what it is, you have to do it, and it's tracked. The pharma doesn't have that.
And sorry, I mean, there's also the problem that indeed the pharma is very good at developing drugs. The problem is that the pharma in the last 10 years has slashed right and left in their research groups, and so they've let go all the people who really can do drug development because of short-term revenues and so on and so on. And they let that work to be done by academic institutions where they don't have the competencies or the will to do that. So now we have a big problem with the early stage drug discovery. That's the generating leads is really a problem. No one does generating leads anymore. And if you want, I mean, I'm trying to work on that, trying to create an institute for drug discovery that would be translational between academic institutions and pharma. It's very difficult to find funding for that because if you go to classical groups of funding like VCs, they don't want to invest because it's too early stage. It's very difficult to fund a company or anything that is if you don't have a lead, and nobody has leads anymore. So there is the problem also. We want to do open innovation, and we go to universities. We want to collaborate with them, and the universities say it's not our job. We don't want to pay for that. And you go to VCs and they tell us it's not our job. We don't want to pay for that. Come back when you have a lead. So who's going to do the leads then? And that's really one of the problems that we're facing today. We're trying to set up something like that. It's called Alpine Institute for Drug Discovery, and it's very difficult to fund. And it's a problem that we've seen, and we get a lot of partners in academic institutions that they say we want you to work with us, but we can't help you because we don't have the funding.
For Lewis.
I think there is an underappreciation of how difficult it is to turn a small molecule into a candidate, at least in tropical diseases. There's many things that have been mentioned. I don't know if this is a sequential conversation or there's too many things happening in parallel. My brain is kind of going a bit mushy already. So the other thing is when you alluded to for instance, the influence that Andrew Whitty has had on GSK. For us, it's been fantastic. Right? I have to say I haven't seen the same thing in other pharma. When we go and talk to them and try to agree, we see that their situation in the company sometimes is quite shaky. We have seen examples with the tuberculosis units in Novartis, maybe in AstraZeneca, that the viability moving forward is a bit in discussion. So I wonder if when you have this senior management, there can be two situations where can help having this pharma that is open to doing this transition with academia. So one is having a character like Andrew Whitney at the top, and the other one is helping build the arguments inside the companies that this is not going to cost you anything. Yeah, and it's only going to bring you good press. It sounds like a bit of a hypocritical thing to say, but maybe this is good enough for these units to be there and be sustainable. But for this to happen, we need public institutions to realize that they have to fund pharma, because otherwise they'll go away. And it's maybe not a politically correct thing to say, but I think that units like ours, and it's not to say that we are brilliant, we are probably average in the industry, they are necessary to help bridge the gap between these academics that might have something that is very basic and translate it into a candidate. I mean, we are desperately looking for projects. I mean, I really resonate with what you were saying. And it would be great to see that this concept of the private and the public sector actually is not, there's not that many differences, and reaching an understanding between the two should be viable.
But Lewis, do you think that if somebody came up with a clinical candidate and demonstrated that it worked in a few patients, right? I mean, to take that molecule all the way to market, how much is it going to cost? £200 million? Well, why can't we do it in the public sector? You know, I agree pharma has got fabulous expertise, but you know, everybody thinks that to develop a drug is 1.2 billion or something. But that 1.2 billion is because pharma's paying for all their failures.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, there is enough clinical expertise, there's enough public charitable funding. If you do have an asset, a clinical candidate, I think, you know, the Indian government will pay for it or something.
Yeah,
£200 million is doable.
The thing is that this, and this is a discussion that goes back to the failures in the industry in the last 20 years. What is a clinical candidate? You know, there's good clinical candidates and not so good clinical candidates. And people file candidates because this is a mark of success. But maybe they know perfectly well that the chances of success moving forward are very little. So,
but I said a molecule that's worked in a few patients, that's different to a clinical candidate.
it's better.
Right, I think that there's a lot to discuss, and people could be just scared off by the sheer size of the complexity of what we are trying to address within a few hours this morning. I think it's important to recognise that each and every step towards having a drug registered, and even beyond that, being made available and used, they all have their pitfalls. There's attrition rates throughout, and all need to be addressed. And we do know that there are assets and expertise both in the private and in the public sector. And sometimes one is better than the other. But I think that what we should be discussing today is through sharing data, information, how can we optimize that system? This is one of the things. And like you said, there will be there are many people working on the same thing, but they are not sharing information, and thus they end up wasting their time. And even if they succeeded, they would all be having about the same thing. And this is true not only for industry, it's true for academia as well. How many times have we been working on the same thing, and then you say, that guy has just published the same thing that we've been working on for 5 years, but we haven't been sharing the data. Okay, so how can we optimize that? This is one of the things. And then the other thing, and I'll say a bit more at the end, is how can we create the ecosystem that favours of that? What are the conditions? There will be presumably no one-fit-all solution, but how can we explore them, try them out, implement some of them? So,
and just to follow up, the reason why I think it's so exciting right now is because what we heard this morning, they are alternative models for drug discovery.
yeah.
It feels like what we need is a rather brutal natural selection process that operates where there are competing models, and some will be appropriate for certain diseases and some will be appropriate for others. That's why I find it quite interesting. There were two more comments, I'll come to you in a second. Could you, if you haven't spoken already today, could you just say who you are?
Sure. So I'm Katie Ellisett, I work with Médecins Sans Frontières. So I guess our kind of entry point into all this debate is about patients. So we really want to see more innovation, want to see patient-focused innovation, but with the aim of getting access for the people who we work for the people who need it. And so in that sense, I was really encouraged to hear your presentation and really excited by a lot of the the ideas that you're coming up with and the way it can really transform how innovation's being less productive into a much more productive. But I also felt quite saddened at the end that we don't yet have an answer to the access question. So we do all this de-risking, and we, in a way we socialise the risk, and then we privatise the reward, because although all the early stage stuff is done in the public domain, it's all open and collaborative, at the point when we get it to patients, we then give away proprietary rights to pharma, and then we know that there was this article published in Blood Journal just earlier this year, where over 100 CML experts were complaining about the fact that of the 12 new cancer drugs that have been given FDA approval in 2012, 11 of them are over $100,000 per patient per year, and that the average cost of cancer drugs has doubled in the last 10 years. It's now in the US around $10,000 a month. And from MSF's perspective, when we think about how this innovation system is leading to something that will deliver for developing countries, it's a complete joke to think that anything that could possibly be priced at that kind of price will make its way into developing countries in a timely manner, unless we have, unless we just resort to compulsory licenses and engine generics and make these drugs without the intellectual property, without sort of, yeah.
But Chaz's point was that that's what the industry's good at, is that you put a compound up for whoever wants to take it on, and you let the competition begin, right? I mean, at that stage, which was a late stage, by the way.
But at that point then, all of this work that's been done is given sort of as a gift to pharma, and they still have their 20-year monopolies that allow them to charge monopoly prices. So we, as the public, are still in a really bad position when it comes to access. And so I guess my question is, how do we address that? Is there, given, what can we leverage if we're putting in so much investment that's then, okay, maybe the only answer, you were just talking about something that sounded even more exciting about maybe the public sector can take on the funding for this research. Because if the public sector in European countries, well, we're actually paying for the medicines, we have socialised systems of healthcare, the NHS will pay hundreds of thousands of times more than the investment that went in to develop the drug in cost of their drug, in paying for access to that drug. So it's a really backward system. Is there not a way to overcome that so that we're not, how do we get rid of monopoly pricing, basically?
I think Kate's point is an incredibly important one. I've not tried to think about that. I've just tried to focus on the early bit and trying to come up with the targets. And my strategy has been, I think there are certain things that industry is brilliant at. GSK is brilliant at high throughput screening, lead optimization, tox, regulatory, ADME, and then the really big clinical studies, the phase 2b, the phase 3 clinical studies. What none of us is any good at is coming up with the right target. And then what also we're not good at, and this is the valley of death, when we get a clinical candidate, we don't know what to do with it. Which patients or patient group to take it into, what dose, how long for, what readout. We're not good at that, the translational piece. But in academia, it's easier to do certain things. Note, I've not said academia is better. I've said it's easier to do certain things in academia. In academia, I can access other academics quickly for free. I can access clinicians. I can work with patient groups. I can access patients. I can access patient material. I can access NHS infrastructure. I can access patient records, etc. So what we're trying to do is to bring that together. Also in academia, you've got individuals who can spend their whole life working on a target or a pathway. So they've got real in-depth understanding. You just can't do that in a commercial setting. So what we're trying to do is to bring together the strengths of both. But we're also trying to bring in the patient groups and the regulators to create this new ecosystem.
I guess the missing point, or the missing piece in that really exciting picture is the access element. And how do you better leverage the investment that you're putting in, the huge benefit that you're giving to these companies, the reward of which will all be privatised to them. Okay, we'll get the treatments, but will the NHS even approve them under NICE? Potentially not if they price them up here. So there's a real, for me there's something to think about how better to leverage that. I don't know, other PDPs can possibly speak to that.
React to points you've been making. First of all, on the idea of promoting public funding, this is exactly what the DNDi is trying to do. So actually, the government would pay for the development and the expensive clinical phases of drug development, And the goal of OSDD India and of the Indian government in setting up that program is to ensure access to deserving populations. So they're ready to fund it. They see that there will be, they see it as a positive investment for their population. As I say, this hasn't yet been tested, but it's an interesting development and something that we would really like to try out with them. So we'll keep you posted on that. But the other thing I'd like to say is you were saying, well, what happens is that you get to be candidate stage and then you give over the proprietary rights to a pharma company. Now, in our case as a PDP, this is not always what happens. I mean, the question of patenting is very much on a case-by-case basis, but more often than not, what happens is that we work with academia to get to the stage where we have a candidate, and we make the decision with the academic partner as to whether or not we should patent, depending on what we perceive to be the value of the compound and so on. What happens then is we don't assign the right, we don't give over the proprietary rights to a pharma partner. We negotiate a license, and we negotiate that license on the basis that yes, they may get a royalty stream in relation to the developed market or the premium market in developing countries, but we negotiate the terms and we make sure that the drug is not sold at more than actual cost for the populations that need it. And that's been our response to how to deal with this access problem. It's fairly, I mean, these are difficult agreements to negotiate, and the terms are agreed on a case-by-case basis, but it is the way that MMD so far has been addressing this issue with the drugs that we've got to approval stage.
There's a three-person queue here. Robert and then Tony on the
Well, I just think if you de-risk the research with public funding, such as even for Alzheimer's disease, if you have a product without the burden of the research costs, you are going to find pharma companies who will license that as a generic. I don't think you have to say that will then go back in as a proprietary compound or branded compound. So I think that there is a way of getting it back into access to patients at a reasonable price without the IP. It will have to be a generic.
Other examples of that you can point to?
Sure, even in DNDi, we've done that with Quasican and Sanofi.
Right. So public domain compounds.
So compounds that we've developed that are now licensed to a pharma company as a generic. And they've done that. And supposedly there's a small profit, but I think the deals that we made at the beginning, they're probably running at a loss, but they agreed to stay.
So it's made under contract. It's made by the company, but on a contract basis.
No, it's licensed to them as a generic.
Okay.
So we're actually, and with them, seeking alternative manufacturers, coalition manufacturers.
Okay. Somebody,
I had a comment on that, if I may. So this works for some diseases and may not work for other diseases.
Right.
I just wanted to say that. So malaria being one, where it works also because downstream you have a mechanism such as the global fund. But it will not work for other diseases also that you mentioned and the DNDi is working on, particularly helminthic diseases for which everything is based currently on donations.
you want to come in?
Just two sort of comments. First of all, I just wanted to support what Marion said. I think it's a good idea to avoid words like give here. Nobody's giving in this field, based on my experience and knowledge, nobody's giving anything to anyone. Agreements are negotiated, and if there are revenue streams, that they're shared. So these are business negotiations that are negotiated between partners, and then everybody benefits if there is a benefit. The other thing that just I wanted to answer Charles's sort of question with a question, which is, here's the problem, and I think where we are right now, as far as I can tell, is we've come up with the best solution that there is, understanding that it may not be a very good solution, which is that in this whole continuum of drug discovery, different institutions play different roles that they're good at. The central problem, one of the central problems, especially in the late stage pipeline and then the access question, is the private sector is particularly good at accepting the risk. The real question, to turn Charles's question around a little bit about the 200 million pounds, it's not the 200 million pounds that's a problem. That's easy, actually. I mean, not for me personally, unfortunately. But, to raise 200 million pounds is not a problem. The problem is to raise 200 million pounds 10, 15, 20, 50 times that yields nothing. Who, in other words, the question is really who is equipped to pay for failure? And that, for better or for worse, however you look at the question, the private sector has taken that role. And they're willing and able to pay for failure. Because, in the rare times that they have a success, their intellectual property rights give them the opportunity to extract economic rents, and that's how they finance failure. So who else is prepared to finance failure on a large and ongoing scale? That's the question.
You hand up first and then I'll come back.
Yeah, just to challenge that a little bit, this idea that it's only companies that will take on risk. And there's a recent book, The Entrepreneurial State, that Mariana Mazzucato has just published, that really shows that actually the state does a lot of risk taking. Because if you look at the amount of R&D that's funded by the state and the amount that's funded by industry, depending on who's fit, it's hard to get exact figures, but you could say, and the paper published in Lancet earlier this year said something like 60% is industry, 30% is public sector, and 10% is philanthropy. That was the John Arna paper that was published. So that's not an uncontested figure, but if you take that, you see that the state is funding a lot of biomedical R&D. They fund primarily the early stage. If you look at the investments made by the NIH, it is colossal. They're investing millions and millions in biomedical research, in R&D. And that is really early stage risky. It's the valley of death, it's where we get lots of failure. So the idea that they're not taking on failure, in fact, especially the US government, are funding lots and lots of failure. They're taking on lots and lots of risk. And once they've de-risked it, the reason why lots of companies are attracted to be in the US is because of the benefits they see of being close to NIH funding and NIH-funded university academics. So you've got a kind of an ecosystem where the state is also taking on a lot of the risk. So I just don't think it's quite true to say that maybe the state is doing it in different ways, but they're definitely open to taking risks.
Sure, that's something you were saying. Do you want to come in?
I totally agree with that. I actually think, at the moment what's happening is that industry has basically said that early discovery is too high risk, and they want academia and the public first to go in. And just to follow up on Kate's example, in the Alzheimer's area, I briefly commented, there's been 10 very large clinical studies recently in the past decade. Phase 3 studies costing several £100 million each, and all of them failed. And now what everybody's saying is we should have dosed the compound earlier. So even before the patients are showing any symptoms. Now, no company is going to do that study. And what's happening now is the NIH are funding that study. So I totally agree. It's the government and the public sector, they do more risky stuff. And I go back to the comment about the 200 million. I deliberately said, when responding to Lewis, is that if you've got a molecule that's shown efficacy in some patients, so that for me is the milestone, that's where you really de-risk that target. And once you've shown efficacy in some patients, you've taken out a lot of the risk, then I think GSK or whatever will be very important.
Did you want to hear on
It's just, I'm not an expert on access and this comparative role of the public and the private sector and how this translates into this access issue. I think I acknowledge that the public bodies probably will take on clinical trials like this that are phenomenally expensive. Nobody else will do it. So that's a donation, let's say, of the public. But what I've seen in the universities, the NIH, and many other bodies, is that actually now they are aware of this. And when they do enter negotiations with the pharma, they want a piece of the cake. I don't know if for the public good or for what, but they are very, very hard. The technology transfer officers are worse than pharma. No, honestly, it's true. So I think that maybe because of the issues that you were mentioning, this has fed back to the technology transfer office, the universities, that they need to show to the governments that they are bringing something back. But I also have to say that by doing that, they are stifling innovation as well.
Yeah, I'd like to make a point on patents and tech transfer is, I know two groups working on African cancernolysis in universities who will not share the research they're doing with us because the tech transfer says that it's confidential. This is a disease that affects, what, 20,000 a year, and they can afford a few cents to pay for a drug. It must be from public purse, but you have it entirely.
Yeah, I wanted to come to Puneet because he's been waiting.
My name is Puneet. I work for an organization called Creative Commons. We make alternative copyright licenses. Some of you may have heard of Creative Commons. If not, I can tell you more about it later. I want to come to this from a slightly different angle, primarily because I know nothing about medicine, and urge you to think from a slightly different point of view. I'm sorry, I don't want to after you people. I talked to Chaz and Thomas at sites. I'm going to reiterate some of the things, so pardon that, but for everyone else's benefit. Creative Commons, the alternative licenses that we make, we do secretly believe that they are not a fix for the copyright system. We believe that they are a patch on a broken copyright system. Though we've never said that really openly. We've tried not to take an open stance. Our constituents, which are hundreds of millions of people around the world, have been pushing us, sometimes gently and sometimes pretty hard, to take a normative stance. 3 weeks ago, we finally did that. The board of Creative Commons publicly supported sort of a movement toward copyright reform. So that's the background that I've come from. When I came in, you were just finishing your presentation, and I saw Chad's presentation, which really blew me away, and then Thomas came up, and what I found was there were spectacularly opposite messages. He was saying, it's broken, and he was saying, look, it's worked fantastically. Okay, perhaps both are right in some ways. And my contention with both of them was, well, particularly with Thomas was, and I was definitely pushing his buttons, and I said that right up front, that maybe it has succeeded spectacularly because you've got the wrong metrics. You're looking at a very small set of people where it has succeeded. But if you change the measurements and bring in the vast, poor population, which gets asymmetrically affected by something bad that happens. You know, like when a flood happens in the United States, which happens every year, we recover all the time. When it happens in Bangladesh, it's a completely different story. In the United States, maybe 10 people will die. In Bangladesh, 1 million people will die. There's a satirical newspaper in the United States called The Onion. And they always put spins on news stories. And there's one news story, a headline, fake headline, that I love they had a long time ago. It said, 5,000 brown people dead somewhere. And I just love thinking about that, because the only time some of these developing countries make news is when something traumatic happens. So it seems that your measure of success is saying that, you know, look, it's succeeded, it's failed in some cases, but we need to continue with that. What I'm trying to say here is, if we believe that story, then we may get lulled into thinking that the way that has been working is still the right way. And perhaps it's not the right way, because what Chad is saying is that it's really, really screwed up. Your contention that you know, private sector takes the risk, from the story that I heard from him, was completely different. It was that he can actually reduce the risk, which he just now also reiterated. So that's, I want you to sort of maybe think about it and respond here or later on. Is the system really broken? Do we really need a completely different way of thinking? And if we continue to listen to your message, we may continue down a path which has worked only very, very asymmetrically. So that's my sort of instigation here.
Do you want to respond to that? Okay.
Sure.
And then I'll come to Peter very quickly.
I think you're right. The industry has succeeded. We've delivered some phenomenal drugs. You know, think of anti-ulcerans, think of HIV. You know, HIV patients are now living where a few decades ago they were dying, etc. So there's been spectacular successes. Not surprising, because the industry employs phenomenally smart people, provides them with access to the latest technologies, and puts in a lot of money. But the problem is, today, if you look at it, we haven't delivered a drug for Alzheimer's, or schizophrenia, or depression, or pain, and we're a million miles from it. And we desperately need those drugs. The whole process is getting more expensive. It's getting more difficult. We're talking about stratification. We're talking about even more data. There is no one organization. It doesn't matter how big GSK is or Pfizer is. No one group can do this on their own. We've got to come together. And the only way to come together is forget about this IP. You know, the early phase, just treat it as a knowledge creation exercise. Because if we don't, you know, we're all going to be patients one day, or somebody that we care about is going to be a patient. You know? Oh, so I think he's right, and I think I'm right as well.
Sorry, there's another person.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So look, there's always a risk in these types of sessions. I mean, we try not to give speeches, so, you know, what I want to say is, I don't want to be misunderstood by trying to oversimplify very complex issues. I certainly didn't mean to imply that the private sector is the only one that takes risk, or that human clinical trials are the only place that there's risk in this, what I like to call, when I give more elaborate presentations about our niche in this issue, that I call the innovation access continuum. And WIPO, as the intellectual property agency, we're focused at the innovation end, but it's linked absolutely to the access question as well. So in treating these complex issues in relatively short presentations, oversimplification is sometimes a risk. So I don't want to be oversimplified. There's risk at every stage. Obviously, what the system as it's evolved, and what we are at risk of breaking out into agreement here, is that, you know, different sectors are better at assuming risk or making contributions at different stages. So that's kind of what we're talking about. So I said, who assumes the risk of failure? Private sector assumes the risk of failure at the late end stage, more so than academic and other institutions. And from the point of view of the American system, which is the WHO speak is the country I know best, there's been a somewhat symbiotic relationship that's developed between basic scientific research done at NIH, supported with taxpayers' funds, and then the private sector actually bringing commercial products to the market. And then, now, there's also the highly legitimate and question that cannot be divorced from all the other questions is, how do we make sure that everybody who needs these products gets them? And that's some of the particular issues that we deal with in the field of public health, because nobody dies if they don't get the iPhone 5 as opposed to the iPhone 4. But people do die if they don't get access to treatments that exist. So one of the things I like and I appreciate and I'll stop here, the things that I appreciate in the way that we talk about these issues now, as opposed to 10, 15 years ago when I was dealing with them wearing a different hat, is that everybody understands that, in fact, innovation and access is part of the same continuum, that you can't talk about one without the other. 10, 15 years ago, the view of the private sector sometimes was, hey, we're innovating, we have delivered HIV products. And it's not our fault that there are people who are poor in poor countries that don't have medical infrastructures. And there was another side that said, you know, people are dying if they don't get these drugs, and they need them, and we don't care who pays for the cost of developing them. And now we say, you know, access is just as important as innovation and vice versa. And that's major progress.
There was, Pete, you want to make a point?
Yes, Peter Murray Rusk. I spent 15 years in Glaxo, pre-GSK, computational medicinal chemistry, and failed to discover anything. What I tried to do was to try to persuade people to raise the pre-competitive level, and that we should have knowledge-based drug discovery. In other words, we were not using the knowledge that was actually there at the moment. We're very bad in the pharma industry at doing this, partly because we don't share it among ourselves, and partly because we don't use the literature and other resources at all well, and we don't bring in lots of things. And for example, we heard about, you know, the potential rewards for a trypanosome drug. I mean, that is public knowledge out in a different sector, which you could answer in minutes, you know, to answer some question. I'm now with the Open Knowledge Foundation, which is essentially one of the sort of co-sponsors of this meeting. So is Matt, And the Open Knowledge Foundation has just run a meeting where we've reached out to all sorts of sectors, both geographically, so we're in 40 countries, but we're also horizontally. So we had people from CERN talking about open hardware. You know, we're going to come. You know, do we want open hardware in drug discovery? It's a massive force for change. You know, people are building PCR machines in their garages and so on. You know, this may well happen. So what I'm going to say simply is, first of all, Matt, do you have a trajectory for what happens after this?
We'll get to that.
That's good. Okay, because you know, I can't offer the OKF, but I think it's got an opportunity to help in two areas at least. One is the definition of open, which we heard about. Was it mainly from you, Robert? You know, what is open? It's a complex question, we have to answer it, but it's really, we have a lot of expertise at answering what is open. The other, I think, is this multidisciplinary, multi-geographic forum, where we can bring in people in a neutral ground and expose a whole variety of people to influences and ideas that they haven't seen before. For example, we've just been got a grant yesterday, a large grant from the World Bank, who is turning from a closed organisation very much to an open organisation. You know, we're catching the spirit of the time, so I'll leave you with that.
Open mind.
Yeah.
Alice wanted to make a quick